Welcome to Bone Spears and Starships. We are proud to present The Ballad of FERU 9. Chapter 1, The Itch. Captain Ramirez, better known as Red to his ragtag crew, slammed a grease-stained mug down on the chipped metal table. The lukewarm coffee did little to soothe the gnawing restlessness that had plagued him since the war ended 2 cycles ago. Civilian life on Mars was peaceful, sure, but it felt sterile. No adrenaline rush, no camaraderie forged in the fires of battle. It was like a part of him had been deactivated. Across the table, Anya Petrova, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, barely glanced up from her datapad. "Another boring day in paradise, Red," she drawled, her voice laced with the same sardonic humor he felt bubbling within him. Red snorted. "Paradise? This is a glorified retirement home for washed-up soldiers." He gestured towards the window, revealing the endless expanse of rusty red Martian plains stretching out to the horizon. "Look at it. Not a single asteroid to dodge, not a single rogue drone to outmaneuver. Just dirt." Anya finally set down her datapad, her blue eyes glinting with a shared frustration. "Don't get me wrong, I appreciate the clean air and a roof that doesn't leak, most days. But yeah, the adrenaline withdrawal is a real pain." The door creaked open, and a lanky figure with a mop of unruly brown hair sauntered in. Mac, their resident engineer, held a toolbox in one hand and a steaming mug in the other. Did someone say adrenaline withdrawal? Or is this another existential crisis meeting? Red and Anya exchanged a knowing glance. Mac, perpetually optimistic and brimming with nervous energy, seemed less affected by the post-war malaise. Maybe because his mind was always buzzing with new projects, even if it meant turning a toaster into a spaceship communicator, which, to everyone's surprise, actually worked. "Both, Mac," Red said with a sigh. "We're both itching for something more." A loud screech echoed through the prefabricated building, momentarily shattering the contemplative mood. Jet, their reckless but skilled pilot, burst through the door, a manic grin plastered on his face. "Guess what, you beautiful bunch of space bums," he yelled, his voice barely above a breathless whisper. "Just intercepted a distress beacon. Seems there's a little fire drill happening over at Sigma Station. Fancy a little field trip?" A jolt of electricity seemed to course through the room. Red felt his blood pumping, the familiar thrill of a potential challenge sparking in his chest. Anya's lips curved into a grim smile. Even Mac's eyes shone with a newfound purpose. Red slammed his fist on the table. "Grab your gear, people. Looks like retirement's officially over." Chapter 2, Bureaucratic Bonfire. The Mechanic, a cobbled-together vessel held together by duct tape, hope, and Mac's sheer genius, lurched out of Martian orbit, its engines groaning in protest. Inside, the tension was as thick as the recycled air. Unlike the sleek, standardized ships of the Galactic Emergency Service, GES, the Mechanic was a patchwork of salvaged parts and mismatched wires. But to Red and his crew, it was home. "All right, Jet," Red barked, his voice tight with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Give me a visual on Sigma Station." Jet, strapped into the pilot's seat, his brow furrowed in concentration, flicked a series of switches. On the central monitor, a holographic image materialized, Sigma Station, a once gleaming hub, now choked with smoke and flames. "Looks nasty, Captain," Jet muttered. "Multiple hull breaches, fire spreading fast. GS already on the scene, but they're moving like molasses in January," Sparks, their tech whiz, interjected, her fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. "Standard evacuation protocols. Estimated rescue time, 2 rotations." Anya, her face grim, glanced at Red. 2 rotations. Lives would be lost in half that time. Red felt a familiar anger bubble up, the same frustration he'd felt countless times during the war, watching the GES's bureaucratic gears grind agonizingly slow in the face of immediate danger. "Red," Mac chimed in, his voice uncharacteristically serious, "we could probably bypass the emergency protocols and get closer. Might risk some hull integrity, but Before Mac could finish, the comms crackled to life. A pompous voice, laced with a thick Venusian accent, filled the cramped cockpit. "Attention, unidentified vessel. This is Captain Elias of the GS. You are in violation of designated emergency response protocols. Identify yourselves and stand down immediately." Red gritted his teeth. "Elias, a by-the-book commander notorious for his adherence to procedure over action." "This is Captain Ramirez of the Mechanic," Red replied, his voice firm. "We have eyes on civilian casualties trapped in the lower decks. Permission to initiate immediate rescue operation." A pregnant pause hung in the air. Then, Elias' voice returned, dripping with condescension. "Negative, Captain Ramirez. Evacuation protocols are currently in effect. Stand down and await further instruction." Red slammed his fist on the armrest. "People are dying down there, Elias. We can get them out faster. That is not your call to make, Captain. Stand down, or we will be forced to take further action." Red locked eyes with his crew. A silent conversation passed between them, a shared understanding. Anya's hands hovered over her medical kit, her jaw set. Mac's fingers twitched towards his toolbox. Jet's knuckles were white around the control stick. Sparks, a mischievous glint in her eyes, began rerouting navigational controls. Red took a deep breath. "All right, crew. Time to improvise." A slow smile spread across his face. "Looks like retirement's officially on hold." Chapter 3, Bending the Rules. The Mechanic lurched violently as Sparks bypassed the standard safety protocols. Red gripped the armrest, his stomach churning as the ship weaved through a debris field surrounding the burning Sigma station. Sparks, a fierce determination in her eyes, kept her gaze fixed on the holographic map. "Almost there, Captain," she gritted out, her voice barely audible over the groaning of the ship. "Just have to navigate this last asteroid cluster." On the main monitor, the image of Sigma Station filled the screen. Flames danced across its metallic hull, spewing thick black smoke into the vacuum. Red could almost feel the heat radiating from the inferno. "Looks like Elias and his precious protocols haven't gotten anyone out yet," Jet remarked dryly, his voice laced with a dark humor. A distress beacon pulsed frantically on the monitor, originating from a section of the station engulfed by flames. "That's gotta be the trapped civilians," Anya said, already pulling on a heat-resistant suit. "We need to get down there, now." Red nodded, a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. "Mac, can you reroute the docking clamps? We're going straight to the lower decks." Mac, a manic grin on his face despite the perilous situation, slammed his toolbox shut. "Consider it done, Captain. Just, don't blame me if the whole ship comes apart." A booming voice crackled through the comms. "Captain Ramirez. You have disobeyed a direct order. Prepare to be boarded." It was Elias, his voice filled with fury. Red ignored him, focusing on the task at hand. "All right, crew. Buckle up. This is gonna be a bumpy ride." The Mechanic lurched forward, bypassing the designated docking bay and plunging straight towards the burning section of the station. Alarms blared, red warning lights flashed. Sparks muttered frantically as she fought to maintain control of the ship. Outside, the station's metallic hull loomed large, its heat scorching the hull of the Mechanic. Suddenly, with a sickening clang, the makeshift docking clamps Mac jury-rigged engaged with a maintenance hatch on the lower deck. Red threw open the cargo bay door. A wave of searing heat and acrid smoke assaulted them. "Go, go, go!" Red yelled. Anya and Mac, fully equipped in their heat suits, dashed into the inferno. Jet stayed at the helm, his face grim. Sparks, her fingers flying across the console, monitored the ship's systems and kept an ear on the GS comms. Red took a deep breath, the oppressive heat already threatening to overwhelm him. He could hear the crackle of flames and the distant screams of trapped civilians. With a determined nod, he plunged into the smoke-filled station, following Anya and Mac. The fate of the trapped civilians, and the future of the Mechanic, hung precariously in the balance. Chapter 4, Baptism by Fire. Red stumbled through the smoke-filled corridor, his throat burning with each labored breath. The flickering emergency lights cast an eerie glow on the twisted metal walls and debris-strewn floor. Anya and Mac were just ahead, their heat suits glowing faintly in the gloom. Ahead, a muffled cry cut through the hiss of escaping steam and the crackling flames. Red pushed forward, adrenaline a potent cocktail in his veins. They reached a sealed blast door, the metal warped by heat. "Looks like a power surge locked it down," Mac grunted, his voice distorted by the helmet comm. Anya knelt beside a control panel, smoke curling from the singed wires. "Bypass won't work. The circuits are fried." Panic welled up inside Red. They were running out of time. The trapped civilians could be succumbing to smoke inhalation or even the encroaching inferno. He glanced back at the corridor. Through the haze, he could see a flicker of movement, a GES shuttle preparing to dock with the station. "They're finally here," Red muttered, a bitter taste in his mouth. But will it be in time? Just then, Sparks' voice crackled through the comms. "Captain, incoming message from the GES ship. Captain Elias is demanding you stand down and allow them to handle the rescue." Red barked a humorless laugh. "Tell him we're already on it, and unlike them, we're actually getting things done." An idea, audacious and reckless, sparked in his mind. "Mac," he said, his voice tight. "Can you hotwire this door?" Mac peered at the control panel, his brow furrowed in thought. "Maybe. It's a long shot, Captain. Risky as hell." "We don't have many options," Red replied, his gaze fixed on the distorted metal of the blast door. "Do it." Mac, ever the gambler, pulled out a multi-tool from his kit and started to work with feverish intensity. Sparks, sensing the urgency, began rerouting power from non-essential systems. Time seemed to stretch impossibly thin, punctuated only by the crackle of sparks and the roar of the flames. Finally, with a satisfying click and a shower of sparks, Mac straightened up. "All right, Captain. One shot at this." Red took a deep breath. "All right, crew. Here goes nothing." He slammed his fist against the control panel. A surge of power coursed through the corridor, and then, with a groan of tortured metal, the blast door lurched open, revealing a scene of utter chaos. Red, Anya, and Mac, bracing themselves against the heat, stepped into the inferno. Chapter 5, Against the Clock. Red, Anya, and Mac were greeted by a scene of utter pandemonium. Sparks of fire danced across a vast control room, flickering computer screens casting an eerie glow on the panicked faces of trapped civilians huddled in the center. Coughing and gasping for breath, Red surveyed the scene. A young woman, fear etched on her face, clutched a whimpering child close. An elderly man lay sprawled on the floor, clutching his chest. In the corner, a group of engineers frantically battled a secondary fire. "We need to get them out, now!" Anya yelled, her voice strained. Red barked orders. Anya rushed towards the injured man, assessing his condition with practiced efficiency. Mac, ever the resourceful engineer, grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and charged towards the secondary blaze. Red waded through the crowd, his eyes scanning for the source of the chaos. On the far side of the control room, a massive console sputtered and sparked, flames licking at its edges. It was the station's main power core, clearly on the verge of a catastrophic meltdown. A horrifying realization dawned on Red. The fire wasn't the only threat, a full-blown power core explosion could obliterate the entire station and everyone on it. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but years of battlefield experience kicked in. He had to act fast, and think even faster. He grabbed a nearby communicator belonging to one of the station personnel. "Sparks. We need immediate extraction. And get me patched through to the GES ship." Static crackled in his ear before Sparks' voice cut through. "Captain, what's going on? We're picking up readings of a potential core meltdown." "There's no time to explain." Red yelled back. "Get us out of here and tell Elias they need to evacuate the entire station, now." A frantic exchange of messages followed. On one hand, Red urged Sparks to prepare the mechanic for immediate escape. On the other, he pleaded with Elias, his voice a mix of urgency and barely concealed anger, to prioritize the full evacuation of the station over following protocol. The tension in the control room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Anya skillfully stabilized the injured man, while Mac managed to extinguish the secondary fire with a muttered curse. The civilians huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, a booming voice filled the room. Not from the communicator, but from behind Red. Captain Elias stood in the doorway, his face grim, flanked by several heavily armed GS troopers. Chapter 6, A Standoff and a Choice. Red spun around, heart hammering in his chest. Captain Elias, clad in his pristine GS uniform, surveyed the scene with a mixture of annoyance and grudging respect. The armed troopers behind him aimed their energy rifles at Red and his crew. "Captain Ramirez," Elias said, his voice clipped. "I see you've decided to take matters into your own hands." Again. Red held Elias' gaze, his own jaw clenched tight. "We didn't have a choice. People were dying." Anya and Mac, their faces smudged with soot and worry, stood behind Red, ready to defend themselves if necessary. The trapped civilians huddled together, caught in the crossfire of this unexpected standoff. Sparks' voice crackled through the communicator. "Captain, the evacuation shuttles are deploying. We can't wait any longer." Elias glanced at the flickering emergency lights, the chaos evident in the room. He seemed to be weighing his options, the rigid adherence to protocol battling with the undeniable need for swift action. "There's a core meltdown imminent," Red pressed, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get everyone out of here, now." Elias took a deep breath, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, he barked out orders to his troopers. "Lower your weapons. Assist with the civilian evacuation. But Captain Ramirez," he added, his voice steely, "you and your crew are coming with us. You have a lot to answer for." Red felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a sense of grim satisfaction. They may not have gotten a hero's welcome, but they had saved lives. And more importantly, they had gotten noticed. As the GES troopers began ushering the civilians towards the newly arrived evacuation shuttles, Red caught Anya's and Mac's eyes. They both wore expressions of weary triumph. They had defied the slow, bureaucratic machine of the GES and made a difference. But the consequences, and the potential cost of their actions, still loomed large. With a heavy heart, Red turned to Elias. "All right, Captain. Let's go." The hangar outside was a scene of controlled chaos. Evacuation shuttles buzzed in and out, ferrying civilians to safety. Red and his crew, disarmed and escorted by GES troopers, stood on the periphery, a sense of unease hanging over them. As the last shuttle left the station, Elias turned to Red. "You may have saved lives today, Captain," he said, his voice grudging. "But you've also violated numerous protocols and endangered yourselves and others. We'll see if your actions were justified, at your official hearing." A cold dread settled in Red's stomach. A hearing. The potential for reprimand, even imprisonment. But amidst the fear, a flicker of defiance remained. They had done what they believed was right, and the grateful faces of the rescued civilians were a testament to that. The hangar door sealed shut, momentarily cutting them off from the vast emptiness of space. Red glanced at Anya and Mac, a silent question hanging in the air. Would they face their uncertain future together, or had their impulsive act of heroism just sealed their fate? As the GES cruiser docked with the crippled Sigma station, taking the mechanic in tow, the answer remained shrouded in the smoke and uncertainty left behind in the station's ravaged control room. The adventure had just begun, and the line between heroes and rogues was about to be fiercely debated. Chapter 7, A Cage of Bureaucracy. Weeks had passed since the Sigma station incident. The once vibrant crew of the mechanic now found themselves confined within a sterile interrogation room aboard the imposing GES cruiser, Colossus. The room, devoid of windows and filled with harsh fluorescent lights, felt like a deliberate attempt to stifle their spirits. Red sat at a metal table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Days of questioning and accusations had worn him down, leaving a pit of anger simmering in his gut. Anya, her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the flickering GS logo displayed on the far wall. Mac, usually brimming with nervous energy, tapped his foot impatiently, a scowl etched on his face. Sparks, the youngest of the group, leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her eyes narrowed in defiance. Across the table sat a panel of GS officials. Commander Elias, his face still etched with a mixture of annoyance and grudging respect, presided over the proceedings. Flanking him were two stern-faced bureaucrats, their expressions unreadable. Captain Ramirez, Elias began, his voice dripping with formality, "We've heard your testimony regarding the events on Sigma Station. While we acknowledge the potential loss of life if you hadn't intervened." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "Your actions," Elias continued, his voice low and clipped, "constituted a blatant disregard for established protocols. You endangered not only your own crew but also the integrity of the rescue mission." Red bristled. "With all due respect, Commander," he retorted, his voice tight with contained anger, "the established protocols were failing. People were dying, and we took action." Anya leaned forward, her voice sharp. The GS response time was agonizingly slow. "We had the means to act quickly and save lives." One of the bureaucrats, a portly woman with a severe hairdo, cleared her throat. "Captain Ramirez, Dr. Petrova. Your concerns are noted. However, bypassing protocols is a serious offense." Max slammed his fist on the table, his voice taut with frustration. "There's a difference between protocol and letting people burn to death." Sparks, ever the tech whiz, chimed in, her voice laced with a sharp wit. "Perhaps the protocols need an update, wouldn't you say? A touch of real-world practicality might go a long way." Elias glared at Sparks, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He cleared his throat, regaining control of the room. "This is not a debate on protocol revision, Specialist Rodriguez. This is a hearing concerning your reckless actions." Red felt a surge of defiance. Reckless? Maybe. But they had saved lives. They had made a difference. He stole a glance at his crew, their faces a mix of anger, exhaustion, and unwavering loyalty. They were in this together, whatever the outcome. The hearing continued, a monotonous cycle of accusations and justifications. The weight of the situation pressed down on Red. Their freedom, their future, hung in the balance. But as the bureaucrats droned on, a spark of determination flickered within him. They weren't done yet. They had a story to tell, a new way of doing things to fight for. Suddenly, the door of the interrogation room hissed open. A tall, slender figure with piercing blue eyes strode into the room, his gaze fixed on Red. He wore a uniform unlike anything Red had seen before, not the sterile white of the GES, but something more rugged, more practical. "Captain Ramirez," the figure said, his voice low and gravelly, "I believe we have a lot to discuss." Red raised an eyebrow, a spark of curiosity igniting in his chest. This was a new twist. Who was this unexpected visitor, and what did he have in store for the ragtag crew of the mechanic? Chapter 8, Branded Renegades. The unexpected visitor introduced himself as Commander Reyes, a man with a weathered face and a sharp gaze that seemed to pierce right through Red. He spoke of a different organization within the vast bureaucracy of spacefaring governance, the Frontier Emergency Response Unit, FERU. These were the unsung heroes, the ones who operated on the fringes, facing challenges the GES deemed too risky or outside their rigid protocols. Reyes' words were a balm to Red's simmering anger. Here, finally, was someone who understood the value of their unorthodox approach. But the path forward wouldn't be easy. "Captain Ramirez," Reyes said, leaning forward in his chair, "your actions were controversial, to put it mildly. You've ruffled feathers at the GES, to say the least. They see you as vigilantes, cowboys who disrupt their precious order." Red snorted. "Saving lives seems a bit more heroic than disrupting order, wouldn't you say?" Reyes smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But the GES is a slow-moving beast, and they don't take kindly to being outmaneuvered. You've become a symbol for those who believe the system is broken, a thorn in their side. Anya leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. So, what does this mean for us, Commander? Rhea's gaze swept across the faces of the mechanic's crew. The GES wants you punished. But I see something else. I see a team with guts, ingenuity, and a willingness to get things done. FERU could use a crew like yours. Red locked eyes with Reyes, a flicker of hope sparking within him. A chance to redeem themselves, to put their skills to use on a larger scale. But he knew it wouldn't be a walk in the park. There's a catch, isn't there? He asked, his voice wary. Reyes' smile widened. Always. Operating outside the established framework has its benefits. But it also comes with risks. No shiny badges, no fancy ships. You'll be working with limited resources, facing situations the GES deems too dangerous. Mac, ever the optimist, rubbed his hands together with a grin. Challenge accepted. Anya, however, remained cautious. What about the hearing? We're facing potential reprimands, maybe even charges. Reyes chuckled. Let's just say I have ways of persuading the bureaucrats to see things differently. The evidence from Sigma Station speaks volumes. Red felt a surge of gratitude. Reyes wasn't just offering them an opportunity, he was offering them a lifeline. But he knew their troubles wouldn't be over. The GES wouldn't take kindly to their defection, and they would face resistance at every turn. All right, Commander, Red said, his voice firm. We're in. But make no mistake, we're not trading one set of chains for another. We fight for what's right, not for some bureaucratic machine. A slow smile spread across Rhea's face. That's the spirit, Captain. Welcome to FERU. It's a bumpy ride, but the view from here is spectacular, especially when you're saving lives. As they shook hands, the weight of their decision settled on Red. They had become renegades, defying the established order. But they were also forging a new path, a path paved with risk and reward. The challenges ahead were daunting, but Red glanced at his crew, their faces alight with a shared determination. Together, they would face the storm, prove their worth, and redefine the meaning of galactic emergency response. Chapter 9, A Risky Rescue on the Run. Weeks had passed since joining FERU. The mechanic, retrofitted with scavenged FERU tech, sported a new paint job, a dark gray with a bold red FERU insignia emblazoned on the hull. Red, Anya, Mac, and Sparks reveled in the freedom, the absence of stifling protocols replaced by an exhilarating sense of purpose. Their first mission took them to the fringes of known space, a remote asteroid belt ravaged by a devastating solar flare. A small mining outpost, Zinja Base, lay crippled, its communication systems fried and emergency beacons offline. This is definitely not on the GES priority list, Anya muttered, studying the sensor readings on the bridge. We're talking weeks before they even consider sending a rescue team. Mac, his fingers flying across the control panel, added, and judging by those power fluctuations, life support systems might be failing on Zinja Base. Red gripped the armrest, his jaw clenched. Time was of the essence. All right, crew. Let's improvise a rescue plan. Sparks, see if you can hack into any residual signals from the base. Mac, get the docking clamps prepped for a rough landing, and Anya, prep the medical bay. We're going in blind. Sparks, her brow furrowed in concentration, tapped away at the holographic keyboard. There's a faint signal, Captain. Emergency beacon on low power. Max slammed his toolbox shut. Docking clamps prepped, Captain. But be warned, this asteroid field looks nasty. Red took a deep breath. All right, crew. Buckle up. We're going spelunking in space rocks. The mechanic, battered but resilient, weaved through the treacherous asteroid field. The klaxon blared warnings as they dodged hurtling rocks and navigated through tight spaces. Finally, they found a sliver of an opening leading to a cavernous space, the location of Zinja Base. The sight that greeted them was grim. The once vibrant mining facility lay in ruins, its metallic hull scarred by solar flares. Smoke billowed from ruptured sections, painting the cavernous space in an eerie gray. "This looks bad, Captain." Jet, their pilot back at the helm, said, his voice tight. Red nodded grimly. "No survivors on emergency channels. We need to find them, and fast." Anya grabbed her medical kit, her face a mask of concern. Mac, ever the tinkerer, pulled out a modified scanner. "Let's see if we can locate any heat signatures." With a heavy heart, the crew disembarked from the mechanic, clad in their protective suits. Mac led the way, his scanner beeping erratically. They navigated through twisted metal corridors and debris-filled chambers, the silence broken only by the hiss of their respirators and the occasional groan of the failing structure. Suddenly, Mac's scanner beeped rapidly. "Life signs detected," he announced, his voice tight with urgency. 2 faint signatures, coming from the lower levels. A flicker of hope sparked within Red. 2 survivors. They weren't alone. They pressed onwards, the air growing thinner and the temperature dropping with each passing meter. The lower levels were a labyrinth of tunnels, the flickering emergency lights casting long, grotesque shadows. Finally, they reached a sealed blast door blocking their path. Mac, ever resourceful, began hacking the control panel with his multi-tool. Anya scanned the area for any potential hazards. "Captain," Sparks' voice crackled over the comms, "we have company. Incoming GES patrol vessel detected." Red cursed under his breath. The news couldn't be worse. They were on a rescue mission, technically operating outside their jurisdiction, and now the very organization they aimed to challenge was hot on their heels. "We can't let them stop us," Red said, his voice firm. "Mac, hurry up with that door." The blast door hissed open, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The lower levels of the base were heavily damaged, dust swirling in the stale air. But amidst the wreckage, Red spotted 2 figures huddled in a corner, a young woman holding onto an older man, both unconscious. "There they are!" Anya yelled, rushing towards the survivors. Just as Anya reached them, the chamber doors slammed open. 2 GES troopers stood in the doorway, their energy rifles pointed menacingly. "FERU renegades," the lead trooper boomed, his voice distorted by his helmet comm. "Stand down and surrender your vessel." Red felt a surge of anger, frustration mixing with a desperate need to protect the survivors. He locked eyes with Anya and Mac, a silent communication passing between them. They were in a tight spot, trapped between duty and defiance. Chapter 10, A Rebellious Rescue. Red stared down the barrels of the GES rifles, his mind racing for a solution. He couldn't surrender, not with 2 unconscious miners depending on them. A fight seemed hopeless, outnumbered and outgunned. But giving up wasn't an option. Suddenly, a mischievous glint sparked in Sparks' voice over the comms. "Captain, I think I can distract our unwelcome guests." Red raised an eyebrow, a flicker of hope igniting within him. "Explain, Sparks. Remember that comm jammer we borrowed from FERU HQ?" Sparks' voice crackled with barely contained excitement. "I can activate it remotely, frying their comms and temporarily blinding their sensors." Mac, ever the pragmatist, chimed in. "That might buy us some time, but not forever. We need to get these miners onto the mechanic, fast." Anya, ever the pragmatist, knelt beside the miners, assessing their condition. "They're weak, but alive. We can get them stable aboard the ship." Red nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "All right, here's what we do. Sparks, activate the jammer as soon as Anya has the miners secured. Mac, you and I will cause a little diversion." Mac grinned, a hint of manic energy returning to his eyes. "Consider it done, Captain." Red turned to the GES troopers, his voice laced with a deceptive calm. "We're just here for the survivors. Let us get them to safety, and then we can discuss your accusations." The lead trooper seemed to hesitate, torn between his orders and the urgency of the situation. Then, with a frustrated grunt, he barked into his calm hold position. "We'll verify their claim." Red knew it was a gamble. They didn't have time for verification, and the troopers would likely call their bluff soon. But it was enough, for now. Anya, with remarkable efficiency, secured the miners onto stretchers. Red and Mac, on opposite sides of the chamber, sprang into action. Mac whipped out a modified welding torch, its blue flame cutting through a nearby support beam with a satisfying hiss. "Hey," the lead trooper yelled, his voice laced with panic. "What are you doing?" Red, taking advantage of the distraction, launched himself at the other trooper, tackling him to the ground. A yelp of surprise was muffled by their helmets as they grappled on the dusty floor. Sparks' voice crackled over the comms. "Jammer activated, Captain. They're blind and deaf for the next few minutes." A momentary silence descended upon the chamber, broken only by the hiss of the welding torch and the grunts of struggle. The GES troopers, momentarily disoriented and unable to communicate, were at a disadvantage. Red wrestled the energy rifle from the surprised trooper, aiming it at the ceiling. With a bang, he fired a warning shot, showering the troopers with a rain of debris. "This is your last chance," Red yelled, his voice distorted by the helmet. "Stand down, or I'll bring this whole place down." The GES troopers, blinded and disoriented, hesitated. The situation was chaotic, and their orders were unclear. Anya and Mac, taking advantage of the confusion, loaded the miners onto a makeshift gurney Mac had cobbled together from scrap metal. "Let's go!" Red roared over the comms. Sparks, her voice laced with nervous excitement, replied. "Docking clamps engaged, Captain. Get back to the ship, now!" Red and Mac, adrenaline pumping, sprinted towards the blast door. As they reached it, Mac paused, pulling a small device from his pocket, a repurposed emergency flare modified to create a blinding flashbang effect. "Cover your eyes," he yelled, throwing the device into the chamber. A blinding flash erupted, momentarily stunning everyone inside. Red and Mac seized the opportunity, pushing through the blast door before it could close. They sprinted back towards the mechanic, their hearts pounding in their chests. The cavern echoed with a series of muffled thuds and shouts as the remaining GES trooper scrambled to regain his footing. But it was too late. Red and his crew were already disappearing into the docking bay, pulling the blast door shut behind them with a resounding clang. With a burst of thrusters, the mechanic tore away from the crippled Zinja base, leaving the bewildered GES patrol in its wake. Red leaned back in the pilot's seat, taking a deep breath. They had done it. They had defied the GES once again, saving lives in the process. But as the vast emptiness of space stretched out before them, Red knew this was just the beginning. The fight for a better, more responsive emergency response system had only just begun. And the crew of the mechanic, battered but resolute, were now fugitives with a cause. The adrenaline rush of their daring rescue was fading, replaced by a sobering realization. They were branded renegades by the very organization they hoped to reform. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. They would face constant pursuit, dwindling resources, and the ever-present threat of capture. But as Red glanced at his crew, their faces etched with determination and a defiant glint in their eyes, he knew they wouldn't back down. They had tasted freedom, the freedom to make a difference, and they wouldn't surrender it easily. The fight for a better future, for a galaxy where saving lives took precedence over bureaucratic protocol, had just begun. The mechanic, a symbol of rebellion and a beacon of hope, hurtled through the vast expanse of space, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 11, A Sanctuary of Sorts. The mechanic, its hull bearing the fresh scars of their daring escape, limped into a hidden asteroid cluster nestled within a nebulous swirling embrace. The flickering gas clouds provided a modicum of camouflage, a temporary haven from the relentless pursuit of the GES patrol cruisers. Inside the cramped cockpit, a tense silence hung heavy. Red, his brow furrowed in concentration, studied the holographic star charts projected before him. Anya, her face pale but resolute, monitored the ship's dwindling energy reserves. Mac, ever the tinkerer, hunched over the exposed engine core, muttering under his breath as he tinkered with salvaged parts. Sparks, usually brimming with optimism, tapped away at the console, her brow furrowed in worry. Captain, Sparks finally said, her voice strained, we're running low on fuel and supplies. A full repair job is beyond our current capabilities with these scavenged parts. Red sighed, the weight of their precarious situation pressing down on him. I know, Sparks. But laying low here for too long isn't an option. The GES will be combing every sector for us. Max slammed a greasy hand on the console, a spark of defiance in his eyes. We can't just sit here and wait to get caught, Captain. We need a plan, a way to fight back. Anya closed her medical kit with a snap. And what about the miners? We can't just abandon them after pulling them out of the fire. Red nodded. Exactly. We need to find a place to get them medical attention, and we need to restock our supplies before the GES catches up. Suddenly, a flicker of movement on the sensor screen caught his eye. Hold on, he said, leaning closer. There's a faint signal coming from the edge of this nebula. An unregistered station, could be a neutral port, a smuggler's den, anything. Anya raised an eyebrow. Sounds risky, Captain. We don't know who we might be dealing with out there. Mac, however, grinned. Risky is our middle name, right, Captain? Red, a spark of determination igniting within him, straightened in his seat. All right, crew. We're going to take a chance. Set course for that unregistered station. Maybe a little chaos is exactly what we need to stir things up. With a collective nod of agreement, the crew of the mechanic sprang into action. Sparks rerouted remaining power to the engines, nursing every ounce of thrust. Mac tightened the makeshift repairs on the engine core, praying they would hold. Anya prepped the medical bay for the miners, their fragile condition a constant reminder of their responsibility. As the mechanic, a battered but defiant vessel, plunged into the swirling nebula, a sense of purpose hung heavy in the air. They were fugitives, yes, but they were also a beacon of hope, a symbol of a new way of doing things. The unregistered station loomed ahead, shrouded in mystery. It was a gamble, but for the crew of the mechanic, it was the only chance they had. They were about to enter a den of unknowns, and the consequences of their choice could determine their fate, and the future of FERU itself. Chapter 12, A Den of Rogues. The mechanic emerged from the swirling nebula, a battered but determined vessel. The unregistered station stretched before them, a haphazard collection of spacefaring junk held together by sheer audacity and duct tape. Rusty freighters jostled for docking space, their flickering lights painting the station in a chaotic kaleidoscope of colors. Red gripped the armrests, his gaze fixed on the station. All right, crew. Buckle up. This isn't exactly a diplomatic visit. Anya, her face grim, scanned the docking bay for any immediate threats. There's a mix of vessels here, freighters, scavengers, even a couple of heavily armed privateers. Mac, ever the optimist, rubbed his hands together. Sounds like our kind of place, Captain. A little chaos is good for the soul. Sparks, her brow furrowed in concentration, fiddled with a device strapped to her arm. I'm masking our FERU's signature, Captain. We're blending in as, well, independent salvage operators. Red let out a humorless chuckle. Independent salvage operators on the run, at that. The docking bay doors hissed open, revealing a motley crew of aliens and humans milling about. Gangly Zalmi with their bioluminescent eyes watched with detached curiosity, while a gruff-looking Togrit mechanic hawked spare parts on a makeshift stall. Red and his crew disembarked from the mechanic, clad in their utilitarian jumpsuits, their FERU badges hidden beneath layers of worn fabric. The air was thick with the smell of engine grease, exhaust fumes, and something vaguely like burnt space cow. All right, crew, Red said, his voice low and firm. We need 3 things: medical supplies for the miners, fuel, and information. Anya and I will handle the medical supplies. Mac, you find a fuel broker, and Sparks, keep your eyes peeled for any trouble, and try to pick up any rumors about the GES patrols. Their makeshift plan lacked elegance, but their situation demanded pragmatism. Anya, with her calm demeanor and medical expertise, seemed to put even the most hardened of spacefarers at ease. Red, with his natural charisma and a few strategically placed credits, managed to secure the necessary medical supplies. Mac, however, wasn't having as much luck. He navigated the maze of stalls and back alleys, his attempts to barter for fuel met with suspicion and derision. The gruff Togrit mechanic scoffed at his salvaged parts, while a group of shifty-looking Rodian scavengers offered him dubious fuel at an exorbitant price. Meanwhile, Sparks, with her keen eye and knack for eavesdropping, gleaned some unsettling information. Rumors of a heavily armed GES cruiser searching for a renegade FERU vessel were circulating freely. It seemed their cover story might not hold for long. Finally, just as frustration began to set in, Red spotted a familiar figure across the crowded landing bay. A tall, slender woman with fiery red hair stood arguing with a hulking Togrian slaver. Red recognized her instantly, Captain Zarya, a notorious smuggler with a reputation for being both ruthless and resourceful. He hadn't expected to find an ally in such a place, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Chapter 13, A Bargain with a Smuggler. Red's heart pounded in his chest as he strode towards Captain Zarya, Anya at his side. The air crackled with tension as the hulking Togrian slaver loomed over Zarya, his guttural voice raised in a heated argument. Zarya, her back straight and her red hair a fiery halo around her head, held her ground, her gaze unwavering. Red cleared his throat, his voice breaking the tense exchange. "Captain Zarya," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "I believe we have a mutual interest in avoiding unwanted attention." Zarya spun around, her emerald eyes narrowing as she assessed Red and Anya. Her gaze lingered on the hastily concealed FERU badge Anya instinctively brushed at with her hand. "Who are you?" Zarya demanded, her voice a husky rasp. "And how do you know my name?" Red met her gaze head-on. "Captain Ramirez, FERU. And we've heard whispers about a certain smuggler with a knack for disappearing acts, especially when the GES comes calling." Zarya's lips curled into a smirk, a hint of amusement flickering in her eyes. "So, rogue FERU agents on the run, are we? Interesting company I keep." She glanced back at the slaver, who grumbled under his breath and stomped off, muttering about troublesome spacers. Red explained their predicament in a concise, urgent tone. The desperate need for fuel, the pursuit by the GES, and the miners on board needing medical attention. As Red spoke, Anya stood beside him, silently conveying the seriousness of their situation with a tilt of her head towards the medical bay access panel. Zarya listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Red finished, she let out a long, slow sigh. "You FERU folks always seem to find trouble. But I have to admit, I admire your enthusiasm." "We're not looking for trouble, Captain," Red said, his voice steady. "We're just trying to do our job, helping those in need." Zarya snorted. "Helping or interfering? That's a fine line in this business." Anya stepped forward, her voice laced with urgency. "Our patients need those supplies. We can offer credits, salvage, even a favor in return." Zarya's eyes flickered with curiosity. "A favor, eh? And what kind of favor could rogue FERU agents possibly offer me?" Red straightened his back, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Information. We have intel on upcoming trade routes, potential pirate operations, things valuable to a smuggler like yourself." Zarya considered the offer, her gaze darting between Red and Anya. The hangar buzzed with activity around them, oblivious to the tense negotiation unfolding. Finally, a slow smile spread across her face, a smile that promised both danger and possibility. "All right, Ramirez," Zarya said, her voice laced with a hint of amusement. "You've piqued my interest. Fuel, some medical supplies, let's see what you FERU folks can provide in exchange for a little discretion." Relief washed over Red, tinged with a sense of trepidation. They had struck a bargain, but with Captain Zarya, there was always a catch. "Just one condition," Zarya continued, her gaze locking onto Red's. "This little exchange stays between us. No heroics, no attracting unwanted attention. You keep your nose clean, and I'll keep the GES off your tail." Red nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He couldn't afford another reckless stunt, not with the miners and his crew depending on him. "Deal," he said, extending a hand. Zarya grasped his hand firmly, her grip surprisingly strong. "Then let's get down to business, Captain Ramirez. We have a ship to refuel and a little information to exchange." Anya let out a barely audible breath of relief. As they followed Zarya through the bustling hangar, Red couldn't help but wonder what they had gotten themselves into. They had found an ally, one as ruthless as she was resourceful. But in the cutthroat world of spacefaring rogues, even a temporary alliance could have unforeseen consequences. Their fight for survival, for a better way of doing things, had taken another unexpected turn. Chapter 14, A Narrow Escape and a Daring Plan. The dimly lit corridor echoed with the rhythmic clang of tools as Mac wrestled with the engine core, sweat beading on his forehead. Sparks, hunched over a makeshift workbench, monitored the jury-rigged fuel lines with a critical eye. "Almost there, Mac," Sparks muttered, her fingers flying across the holographic display. "Just a few more tweaks and this bucket of bolts might actually fly again." Mac grunted, tightening a final bolt. "Don't jinx it, Sparks." "But seriously, Captain Zarya's fuel is some good stuff. Cleaner than anything we've ever managed to scrounge up on our own." Suddenly, the harsh blare of an alarm sliced through the air, sending shivers down their spines. Red, his face grim, burst through the doorway, Anya close behind. "Trouble?" Mac asked, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Big trouble," Red replied, his voice tight. "Seems Captain Zarya underestimated the reach of the GES. They've put a lock on the entire station, searching for us." Sparks swore under her breath. "We just refueled. We're not ready for another fight." Anya's brow furrowed in worry. "What about the miners?" "They're still too weak to move." Red scanned the room, his gaze falling on the ventilation shaft access panel nestled near the ceiling. "There's a chance. It's a tight squeeze, but it might lead us outside the station. We can regroup and figure out our next move." Mac whistled. "Ventilation shafts? That's some serious escape from prison movie stuff, Captain." "Desperate times," Red muttered, already unbuckling his jumpsuit. "Anya, you stay with the miners. Patch them up as best you can. We'll create a diversion and get back to you as soon as we can." Anya nodded, her eyes filled with concern but also unwavering resolve. "Be careful, Red." Red gave her a reassuring squeeze of the shoulder before turning to Mac and Sparks. "All right, crew. Time for a little improvisational escape plan. Let's show the GES the meaning of a slippery space slug." A tense silence descended upon them as Red, Mac, and Sparks donned their helmets and squeezed through the narrow ventilation shaft opening. The claustrophobic space was filled with the smell of stale air and recycled coolant, their movements restricted by the cramped metal walls. Meanwhile, in the bustling hangar, Captain Zarya, alerted to the GES lockdown, stood at the docking bay entrance, a dangerous glint in her emerald eyes. A group of heavily armed GES troopers surrounded her, their energy rifles pointed menacingly. Captain Zarya, the lead trooper barked, his voice distorted by his helmet comm. "We have reason to believe you are harboring fugitives." Zarya laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Fugitives? In my humble station? Don't be ridiculous." The lead trooper stepped forward, his voice hardening. "We have scans. A FERU vessel recently refueled here." Zarya's smile widened, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Perhaps you should have checked your scans a little more thoroughly before barging into a private establishment, officer." With a swift movement, Zarya grabbed a hidden blaster pistol from her boot holster and fired a precise shot. The hangar lights flickered and died, plunging the space into sudden darkness. The GES troopers, momentarily disoriented, scrambled for cover. In the ensuing chaos, Zarya ducked behind a stack of cargo containers, a mischievous grin on her face. It seemed the rogue FERU crew had gotten themselves into a tight spot, but Captain Zarya wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Meanwhile, Red, Mac, and Sparks crawled their way through the labyrinthine ventilation shaft, their progress slow and arduous. the air grew thin and stale, making it difficult to breathe. They could hear the muffled sounds of shouts and blaster fire echoing from above, a grim reminder of the chaos unfolding outside. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a maintenance hatch leading to the outside of the station. Red pried it open, revealing the vast emptiness of space beyond. The sight took his breath away, but there was no time to admire the view. "Let's go," he hissed, clambering through the hatch. Mac and Sparks followed close behind, their hearts pounding in their chests. They clung to the station's exterior hull, exposed and vulnerable in the inky blackness. But before they could formulate a plan, a blinding light engulfed them. A GS patrol cruiser loomed before them, its powerful searchlights cutting through the darkness. They were spotted. The chase was back on. Red cursed under his breath. Their daring escape had backfired spectacularly. He could feel the heat of the cruiser's engines as it maneuvered closer, its massive cannons primed and ready to fire. Panic threatened to rise, but Red pushed it down. He wouldn't let fear cloud his judgment. "Sparks, can you reroute the emergency beacon?" he shouted over the hiss of leaking oxygen. "Working on it, Captain," came her strained reply. "But the signal's weak, all this metal shielding." Suddenly, a booming voice cut through the comms. "This is Captain Zarya of the Starfire. Stand down, GS, or face the consequences." Red's head snapped towards the source of the voice. In the distance, a sleek freighter, its hull adorned with a stylized crimson star, emerged from behind the station, its engines blazing with raw power. It was Zarya, and she wasn't alone. Flanking her were two other vessels, their hulls bearing the insignia of notorious pirate crews Red had only heard whispers about in dark corners of spaceports. "Captain Ramirez," Zarya's voice crackled over the comms, laced with a hint of amusement, "looks like you won't need to rely on those ventilation shafts after all. Consider this a favor in return for your intel." Red stared in disbelief. Zarya had rallied a band of pirates, seemingly out of a twisted sense of honor or perhaps a desire to spite the overbearing GS. Either way, it was their only chance. "Hold on tight, crew!" Red yelled, activating the mechanic's emergency thrusters. The battered ship lurched forward, propelled by a burst of raw power as it weaved through the debris field surrounding the station. A thrilling chase ensued. The GS cruiser, caught off guard by Zarya's intervention, unleashed a volley of blaster fire. The pirates, with surprising coordination, returned fire, their ships dancing a deadly ballet through the asteroid field. Red felt a surge of adrenaline as he expertly maneuvered the mechanic, dodging laser blasts by a hair's breadth. Sparks, her voice crackling with excitement, guided him through the asteroid maze, plotting an escape route. Mac, ever the pragmatist, kept an eye on their remaining fuel reserves, hoping they could outrun the cruiser's superior firepower. The battle raged on, the fate of the crew and the future of FERU hanging in the precarious balance between a desperate escape attempt and the ruthless pursuit of the GS. Chapter 15, A Desperate Gamble. The mechanic, battered and bruised, danced a desperate jig through the asteroid field. Red felt the strain in his arms as he wrestled with the controls, dodging laser fire that scorched the ship's hull. Sparks, her face illuminated by the flickering holographic displays, shouted updates. "Captain, cruiser shields are down for a limited window. Targeting their engines might be our only shot." Red gritted his teeth. A risky maneuver, but their only hope. He slammed the targeting console, locking onto the cruiser's exposed engine core. "Mac, brace for impact," he roared. Mac, ever vigilant, secured himself into his co-pilot's chair. Anya, her face pale but resolute, held onto a makeshift gurney transporting the unconscious miners in the makeshift medical bay. Red steered the mechanic on a suicidal course, aiming directly for the cruiser's exposed underbelly. The GS vessel, caught off guard by Zarya's daring distraction, scrambled to raise its shields. Just as the mechanic entered firing range, the cruiser's shields flickered back online, but it was too late. Red unleashed a concentrated blast of energy, pouring everything they had left into the attack. The blast impacted the cruiser's engine core with a blinding flash. A shudder ran through the mechanic as they were buffeted by the shockwave. Red fought to maintain control as the cruiser, its engines crippled, veered off course, limping away from the asteroid field. A collective cheer erupted over the comms. Zarya's voice, laced with a hint of grudging respect, crackled through the speakers. "Nice shot, Ramirez. Looks like you managed to clip their wings." Red let out a shaky breath of relief. They had survived, but the victory was bittersweet. The mechanic was heavily damaged, its systems on the verge of failure. They wouldn't be able to sustain another fight. Suddenly, a new worry gnawed at him. "Sparks, how are the fuel reserves?" Sparks' voice came through strained. "Critical, Captain. Barely enough to reach a neutral zone on the edge of this sector." Red cursed under his breath. They had escaped the immediate threat, but their situation remained precarious. They were low on fuel, their ship barely clinging to operational status, and the miners needed proper medical attention beyond the limited resources on board. "All right, crew," Red said, his voice firm despite the gnawing worry. "We need to find a safe haven, a place to repair the mechanic and get the miners the medical attention they deserve." Mac, ever the optimist, piped up. "Maybe one of those pirate captains Zarya knows can point us in the right direction. After all, we owe them one." Red glanced at Anya, who nodded in agreement. Zarya's unexpected intervention had saved them, but trusting pirates was a gamble. Yet, they had no other choice. "Sparks, see if you can hail Zarya's ship," Red said. "We need a safe harbor, and maybe, a doctor who doesn't ask too many questions." Anya's brow furrowed. "What are we getting ourselves into, Red?" Red met her gaze, a mixture of hope and trepidation in his eyes. "Survival, Anya. Maybe even a chance to regroup, to fight another day. And who knows, these pirates might just surprise us." With a heavy heart but a steely resolve, Red steered the mechanic towards Zarya's freighter, a battered vessel seeking refuge amidst a band of outlaws. They had escaped the clutches of the GES, but the fight for a better future, for a galaxy where saving lives took precedence over bureaucracy, was far from over. The journey ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, but one thing was certain: the crew of the mechanic wouldn't back down. They were fugitives, yes, but they were also a beacon of hope, and their fight had just begun. Chapter 16, Vindication and a New Dawn. Weeks had passed since the harrowing escape from the asteroid field. The mechanic, nursed back to a semblance of functionality thanks to the surprisingly skilled engineers under Captain Zarya's command, docked at a hidden outpost on the fringes of former GES-controlled space. The miners, fully recovered under the care of a gruff but surprisingly competent pirate doctor, were finally reunited with their families. Anya, her face etched with a newfound determination, stood beside Red on the bridge as they watched a holographic news report broadcasted from a neutral station. It depicted the capture of a high-ranking GES commander, accused of corruption and abuse of power. The report mentioned leaked data exposing the commander's ruthless tactics, including the fabricated accusations against Red and his crew. "They're calling it the FERU 9 incident," Sparks announced, her voice laced with a hint of satisfaction as she manipulated the holographic display. Apparently, the data leak triggered a massive public outcry. Red felt a surge of vindication wash over him. The truth had finally come to light, their names cleared. But the victory felt hollow. Too many lives had been lost, too much damage done. A knock on the bridge door startled them. It was Zarya, her fiery hair pulled back in a tight braid, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "Captain Ramirez," she said, her voice gruff. "There's someone here to see you." A moment later, a familiar figure entered the bridge, his posture ramrod straight, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and determination. It was Commander Reyes, the gruff but ultimately decent officer who had first recruited Red into FERU. "Red," Reyes said, his voice thick with emotion. I owe you an apology. I was wrong to trust the false reports. You and your crew." Red cut him off, his voice surprisingly calm. "It's all right, Commander. We all make mistakes. What matters now is that the truth is out." Reyes nodded, his gaze shifting towards Anya and the others. The data leak, it exposed a lot of corruption within the GES. There's a movement brewing, Red. People are demanding change. A flicker of hope ignited in Red's eyes. Maybe, just maybe, their ordeal had served a purpose. What happens now? Anya asked, her voice soft. There's an investigation, Reyes said. A chance to reform the GES, or dismantle it altogether, depending on the findings. Red glanced at his crew, their faces reflecting a mix of exhaustion and newfound purpose. They had been through hell and back, branded as fugitives for simply trying to do the right thing. But they had emerged stronger, their bond as a crew forged in the fires of adversity. We have a lot to rebuild, Red said, his voice firm. But we're not giving up. The mechanic may be a bit worse for wear, but she still flies. Zarya, a smirk playing on her lips, interjected. And speaking of flying, I might have a proposition for a crew with a knack for getting into trouble. Red raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement dancing in his eyes. Trouble, huh? Sounds interesting. Tell me more, Captain Zarya. As Zarya outlined a daring plan, a plan that involved challenging the corrupt remnants of the GES and restoring order to the sector, Red knew their fight was far from over. But this time, they wouldn't be alone. They had allies, a crew of their own, and a newfound sense of purpose. The mechanic, a symbol of rebellion and a beacon of hope, cast its shadow across the vast expanse of space, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fight for a better future had just begun, and the crew of the mechanic, forever marked by their ordeal, were ready to lead the charge. The galaxy might not be ready for them, but Red and his crew were ready for the galaxy. Epilogue. Years had passed since the FERU 9 incident shattered the galaxy's perception of the once venerated Galactic Enforcement Service. Red Ramirez, no longer a captain on the run, stood before a crowd of cheering supporters. He had become a symbol of resistance, his name synonymous with the fight for justice and reform. The mechanic, painstakingly rebuilt and boasting several upgrades courtesy of Captain Zarya's surprisingly skilled engineers, gleamed under the floodlights. It was no longer just a ship, it was a monument to the crew's unwavering spirit and a testament to the power of standing up for what's right. Anya, now a decorated medical officer within the newly formed Galactic Peacekeepers, stood beside Red, a gentle smile playing on her lips. The organization, built on the ashes of the corrupt GES, embodied the ideals they had fought for. Mac, ever the tinkerer, beamed from the crowd, his grease-stained overalls a badge of honor. Sparks, sporting a more professional hairstyle but with the same glint of mischief in her eyes, stood next to him, now a highly sought-after communications expert. Captain Zarya, perched on the mechanic's railing, her crimson hair catching the light, raised a flask in a silent toast. Though their paths rarely crossed anymore, the bond forged in the fires of rebellion remained strong. Red's voice, filled with a quiet strength, resonated through the crowd. He spoke of the sacrifices made, the lessons learned, and the enduring hope for a brighter future. The galaxy was still a vast and complex place, but a seed of change had been planted. The crew of the mechanic, once branded as renegades, were now hailed as heroes. Their story, a testament to courage and resilience, served as a beacon of inspiration, a reminder that even the smallest spark of defiance could ignite a revolution. As Red finished his speech, the crowd erupted in cheers. The mechanic, a symbol of hope, cast its shadow across the cheering throng. The fight for a better future was far from over, but with a renewed sense of purpose and a galaxy finally ready to listen, the crew of the mechanic knew they were no longer alone. They were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. We would appreciate it if you would be so kind too. Like and subscribe. Comment below. We'd love to hear your fan theories in the comments. And hit up our Discord. @Bone Spears and Starships.